Hello, everybody. You're about to meet Hamza Khan. Hamza describes himself as an author, educator, and entrepreneur. And as you will see, he is indeed all those things. His TED Talk received more than 2 million views, and his book, Leadership Reinvented, offers a roadmap to productivity, resilience, and constant change. Here is Hamza.
Hello, everybody. I am beyond delighted to bring to you Hamza Khan, who is an author, educator, and entrepreneur. That's all I'm going to say about him here. You can read more about him in the show notes, and I might have to say something. No, no. See, this is an example. He's going to kill all of that. He's an author, educator, and entrepreneur. Hamza, I have a bunch of stuff about you that I pulled off of the web. I know you have your book, your TED Talk, 2 million views. I've read and read about you, and I am so thrilled that people get a chance to hear your thoughts.
Dr. Jean, I don't know what to say. I am truly starstruck. To hear you say that about me is quite a surreal experience because I can't tell you, I'm a fan, like a legitimate fan. I think I'm going to stumble throughout this entire recording because I struggle with imposter syndrome, and to be with someone like yourself, a stalwart, a vanguard, who's focused on such important subjects at a time where those topics, those subjects, diversity, equity, inclusion, accessibility, are disturbingly, disappointingly, and dishearteningly coming under fire. It's such a I can't even begin to express how much of a privilege and how inspiring and motivating it is to be in the presence of a titan like yourself. Thank you.
Well, thank you. So here's what I want to know. I want you to elaborate on what you just said. What makes every generation, every period think this is the time that try men's souls, right? They think this is the one that's unprecedented. What is it about what's going on today that you're looking at, that you're talking about?
Ooh, where do we begin? I mean, for starters, we're recording this in 2024, and we're seeing terms like woke culture being co-opted. We're seeing an active war against diversity, equity, and inclusion, legislation, and safe spaces. We're seeing the world get smaller for people who identify with different intersectionalities like you and I do. I identify as a South Asian man. I identify as a Muslim man. I identify as somebody that is neurodivergent who has struggled with mental illness. I identify as somebody with different communication styles. I mean, you look at the two of us and you then take stock of all of the members of this very esteemed community of listeners of Leading Consciously. And we represent a full spectrum of humanity. And for us to acknowledge those intersectionalities, for us to feel comfortable in spaces, is becoming increasingly difficult. And I feel this as somebody that has a considerable amount of privilege as a practitioner, as a scholar, as somebody who has achieved a level of socioeconomic comfort. Even now, in this current avatar, I'm still feeling like my world is getting smaller. It's happening in different ways. It's happening when I take a keynote stage and I'm automatically discounted because of my experience. And I know that this is the fact because afterwards I'll have people come up to me and say, Hamza, you were so eloquent. And here I am thinking I received that compliment. It's a beautiful, well-intentioned compliment. But why was the assumption before I opened my mouth that I wasn't going to be eloquent? Another example is whenever I'm crossing the border. I am a dual citizen. I was born in the US. I lived for most of my life in Canada. And even now, when I cross the border, I'm randomly selected because some other asshole named Hamza Khan ruined it for the rest of us. He ruined it for Team Hamza Khan. And now my name is on a no-fly list. Not my name specifically, his name, but unfortunately, the governments of both countries can't make the distinction between this Hamza and that Hamza. They have no problem doing it when it comes time to collecting taxes. But for whatever reason, whenever I'm crossing the border, come on over here. And it's an utterly dehumanizing experience. And I find it hard to believe that anybody else is experiencing the levels of micro and macro aggressions that are felt by people who know what it's like to be the other. And
Okay,
I
so
want to actually, sorry, go ahead.
yes, I want to ask you about that. You wrote a book, you are educator, entrepreneur, author.
Mm-hmm.
You've given TED. How do you channel what are your feelings, number one, about all of that? Because you have some outrage in you, but I also sense that because of what you've written and because you're putting your work out there, that you also have some constructive, a forward movement in how you feel. So talk about that.
Yeah,
You
that's
stopped
really
at the
good.
airport. You're pulled over. Now,
Yeah.
what's going on?
What's going on? I mean, let me give you the story. This is what a typical experience looks like for me. I will go to the booth and I'm very rarely made eye contact with because that person is overwhelmed, underpaid, and they're going through the motions as well. I have nothing but love and sympathy and empathy and compassion for my fellow workers. I also understand, like myself, that they are at the receiving end of a status quo that is disenfranchising them, that's creating conditions for them that are less than ideal, that's disengaging them and making it difficult for them to thrive. So what happens in this interaction is that they'll take my passport, they'll have me do a biometric scan, and then they'll have me do what I describe as a perp walk. They'll actually turn off the light in their booth. They'll confiscate my passport and they'll say, follow me. And I'm lucky if they say, follow me. Most of the time, it's just a dehumanizing gesture to just follow them. And then I'll go into this dark, dingy waiting room. My expectations are not being managed. Then the most recent experience that I had happened a couple of weeks ago where they took me into an office and they interrogated me for an hour. And they were asking me questions about my family, about my residential history, my educational history, going into in-depth conversations about my work, only to discover, Dr. Jean, only to discover that I'm a patriotic American, that I actually served in the Canadian Armed Forces as a reservist, that I am a eager taxpayer. I actually regard my taxes as membership fees. And so I overpay all the time. I don't have a single blemish on my criminal record, not even a parking infraction. And you know what the most ironic thing for me is, Dr. Jean? The Department of Homeland Security, the Canadian Armed Forces, the Canadian government, the US government, they're all my clients. I have trained their bosses. So I'm not even mad at them. This is the thing, right? I'm not mad at the border agent. I'm not mad at the disengaged barista who's taking my order, who actually resents taking my order because they're so exhausted at the end of the shift. I'm not even mad at the boss that I had a couple of workplaces ago that gaslit me, that bullied me, that ostracized me. Because we are all, as I said at the beginning of this answer, at the receiving end of, I'm just gonna say it. I feel comfortable saying it. Systemic oppression. That's what it
Yes.
is. It
Yes.
is systemic oppression, and I feel like my world is getting smaller. And spaces like this to say that out loud are sacred because I have been in workplace settings very recently where I was given a list of words not to say. And some of those words were diversity, equity, and inclusion. Words that define my life, my lived experiences, my ways of thinking and being. I essentially was told by another adult not to acknowledge what makes me me.
Wow. Now I have people, I'm in Houston and this is Governor Scott
Yep.
and the Texas has implemented, eliminated DEI from the public universities. That's where I am. That's my college.
When I heard that law, my first thought was, wow, this is the dying breath. This is the final gasp from a dying institution to want to make the world smaller for people whose worlds are already tiny, whose foundation beneath their feet has been crumbling since the inception of this country, even before then. So when I received those instructions, I was happy to play ball because my appeal, similar to yours, Dr. Jean, is we can world walk. We can exist in multiple spaces. We can exist on a keynote stage, in a boardroom, in a cookout, in a backyard, hanging out with people that we love and care about, but equally effectively code switch to speak to an audience that wants to hear us in the way that they're prepared to hear us. So I did not say the words diversity, equity, inclusion, accessibility. I did not acknowledge intersectionality. I made zero reference to what makes me me. But what I did share was a picture of my mom, who is a visible Muslim wearing a hijab. What I did talk about was belonging. What I did talk about was thriving. What I did talk about was community. I said the exact same things I would have said with precision, but I actually feel like I communicated them in a way that allowed for the audience to receive that message where they were at.
Yes, and that's the trick. You can ban words, you can outlaw, but if the message is pure and clean and honest, they will get it. New words will come.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Dr. Jean, I have so many questions for you. Right before we logged on, you mentioned that you have also experienced feeling like you don't belong. And that to me is understandable, but also surreal, because as I shared at the top of our recording, I look to you as a bit of a superhero. Like you are who I want to be when I grow up. I look at your accolades, I look at your accomplishments, I look at your focus explicitly on leadership and change, and I think to myself, my goodness, Dr. Jean did it. I can do it. I have to do it. Like I am truly emulating the career and academic path that you're on. But I'm a little scared to know that you have experienced feeling like you don't belong. Could you elaborate on that? Maybe share a story
I
or a
was
recent
the
experience?
only Black faculty member
Okay.
of 25 people
Wow.
for about 15 years.
Were they lonely?
Well, here's the irony. Let me say something.
Sure.
I grew up in the segregated South.
Wow.
Where white people were over there. There was the street that divided our neighborhood from their neighborhood. I won't even tell you the horror stories because they had beautiful trees. So I would like to go walk over there, but that wasn't a safe thing to do. So I learned that white people were dangerous for the most part. Then I went to integrated high school and integrated college. When I was in college, every now and then I'd find myself in the dorm room, lying on the bed with four of my good friends. And all of a sudden, I'm surrounded by white people.
Oof.
And one of my closest friends would look at me and said, "We've become white, haven't we?" And I said, "Yep." And she said, "Jean, we're your friends. It's okay." And I said, "Okay, give me a minute. And then I'll sit, y'all just talk, give me a minute." And then all of a sudden they become my friends again. So I had learned the skill when people became white people, I had learned the skill to ride that wave, and then they would become people again.
Wow.
So at my college, there were three people I had been with for most of that time. We were close. We knew each other's families. I knew their boyfriends or spouses. We were friends. I loved them. But sometimes sitting in the faculty meeting, they would just become white.
Right.
And so I had to just I had known this was a phenomenon. And so I had to stay quiet. I never told them, by the way. I told my college friends for whatever reason, I would tell them, or they'd look at me and say, "What's wrong with you?" And then so I just finally broke down and told them one day. So my college friends knew this happened to me and they understood it. And then this is like post-civil rights movement. So
Yeah.
they get all of it. I never told them, my faculty friends, "Hey, you've become a white person." Or they'd start talking about a student who's a person of color, and they would be saying things that a white person would say, even though they were social workers and they believed in systemic oppression.
Sure.
Right? Systemic oppression is what we teach our students.
Yep.
This is no secret here. I knew where their hearts were, but their words sometimes didn't match the social work ideology. It didn't match their hearts. I wrote a blog post about one incident that I can share with you at some time where I had to go to bat for a student. And I was the only, there were two of us. One, a Hispanic faculty member kept egging me on, Jean, they'll listen to you. Say it, say it, say it. So it was like I was surrounded by white people. But as before, this white faculty member looked at me and she said, Jean, what's going on? There's something you're seeing that we're not. And
Right.
that broke the ice and we got through it.
Wow. Dr. Jean, you one of the ways you're described online as somebody who has an ability to translate knowledge bases into accessible forms. And you've done that for me. You've actually changed the way I think. You've gifted me with a concept that I'm eager to share with my community and the people in my life, which is suddenly people become their race. I'm getting chills because I've experienced that. I continue to experience that vividly, but I've never actually thought of that as an active process. It's so true. There are times now where, as a keynote speaker, I'll get on stage and I'll get overwhelmed because I'll be staring at a sea of people that are white. And it is jarring for me when you consider the way I grew up. I grew up in New York in a pre-gentrified Astoria, Queens. And back then, my family shared socioeconomic similarities with other new immigrants to that neighborhood. We're talking about Mexican immigrants, Filipino immigrants, Arab immigrants, Greek immigrants, Bangladeshi immigrants, so on and so forth. And my schooling even reflected this. So I felt like I was surrounded by a diversity of people during my formative years. And the same thing happened when my family then moved to Scarborough, Ontario, in Toronto, in Canada. And there it was really interesting because we were also in a new immigrant haven, but this time it was much more homogenous. It was so diverse that it was homogenous. I was surrounded by fellow South Asians. I was surrounded by Indians, Pakistanis, Bangladeshis, West Indians, Sri Lankans. And because we were near a mosque, we also had another layer of homogeneity in terms of religion. We had Arab and Somali people around us in our neighborhood. And then things changed for me when I went into post-secondary. So up until post-secondary, my worldview was one in which on TV, in movies, in video games, and in books, in my imagination, my heroes are white. But in my lived experiences, I'm surrounded by people who look like me, sound like me, and we share socioeconomic, religious, racial, and cultural similarities. But then university happens. And then my first job happens. And then my second job happens. And my third job happens. And I'm like, holy smokes, I'm the only person of color here. I'm the only Muslim here. And I got to say, what you just described of being the only Black faculty for 15 years, I feel a profound loneliness in my role as a thought leader, educator, author, entrepreneur, the way that you so beautifully described my work portfolio composition right now. I'm still that person. I'm still the only person more often than not in the spaces that I'm in. And so again, like this conversation that we're having right now is more than just a podcast for me. It's an opportunity to be with a Titan.
Yeah, this is the question I get asked most by people. Please. How do you handle it? How do you handle if you're the only person of color and a white person says something offensive? How do you handle if you want to strangle somebody for what they just said? How do you handle it? And I said, I have trained my mind to switch perceptions and thoughts. That's just it. I know I can switch out of it. I can look at this stack of papers and I can either see a pile of junk or I can see important work to be done.
Yep.
That's my choice.
Yeah. I do the same. I actually, the heuristic that I rely on is seeing them as babies and just remembering that we're all children. At one point, we were all these supercomputers, infants, and we ingested information explicitly and implicitly. We absorbed the world around us. And so they're acting from a place of fear more often than not. It's very rare that you actually run into, at least in 2024, a truly malevolent person.
Right.
Even the most extreme forms of racism that I've experienced, I don't believe came from somebody who was truly a mustache twirling, Machiavellian, psychopathic, narcissistic type, maybe subclinically, but they were acting from a place of self-preservation, from fear, and they were just repeating cycles of trauma that they have experienced, most likely as a result of somebody else in their proximity that passed on the trauma to them. This happened to me when I was working at a large educational institution in Canada many, many years ago. And it was at this place where Dr. Jean, they had won an award for 5 years in a row as Canada's best DEI employer. So just imagine early 2010s, this large educational institution receives this accolade 5 years in a row, the best place to bring your whole self to work. So much so that my boss at the time said, Hamza and everyone else, bring your whole self to work. Right. And it was very enticing, but I see the wheels turning, Dr. Jean, because you know how hollow that can be if it's not actually met with the appropriate safeguards. And so I brought my whole self to work. I brought the enterprising spirit of my grandfather. I brought the revolutionary spirit of my grandmother. I brought the full intersectionality of an Indian man, a Muslim man living in North America who is still perceiving the echoes of colonization, who still sees it in my father's eyes, who still sees it in the way that my mother acts, and the frustration that they express because they weren't able to fully realize their lives because they experienced the cascade of negativity that came from oppression. So I brought my whole self to work and I was punished for it.
Yes.
I was punished for being enterprising. I was punished for bucking the conventions of a status quo workday that I didn't fully agree with because it resembled to me the same dialogues, the same structures. It was upholding the same institutions that led to colonization. And that's something that I feel I can say now in 2024. I feel galvanized to say that the same structure that produced colonization has also passed through history and manifests in the form of economic systems, political systems.
Absolutely.
It manifests in the form of the traditional 9 to 5, Monday to Friday workday. You can actually trace the legacy of colonization to the way people show up to work today. And I was punished for it. And that was a story that I didn't tell anyone because I didn't think anybody would believe me. I didn't think anybody would believe that this boss who said, bring your whole self to work, who on the surface appeared to be a champion for DEIA, who himself identified with marginalized communities, could also bully somebody like me. It just seems so far-fetched. And
we replicate that which we detest.
We replicate that which we detest. And I actually had one person tell me, they said, Hamza, I'll never forget. They said, you're playing oppression Olympics. Who's more oppressed? And I was like, well, first of all, that person, let's just say that it was ironic coming from that person. But anyways, for 10 years, I languished, Dr. Jean. For 10 years, I fell into a spell of depression. My anxiety was
Wow.
through the roof. I had to seek therapy. It was just a mess. And I feel like I've only now emerged from that because the moment in time has synchronized, where the dialogue that was happening in my brain, the feelings in my heart have now been inverted. And we're seeing this play out in the zeitgeist.
Okay, so that answers my question. Initially, you internalized it,
Yes.
and then you sought therapy and reflection and probably read a ton of stuff. And then you were able to put what your experience in context. So it wasn't just you alone. This is the way the system is set up. And others feel the same way. And then once you got that understanding, you drop on board to help lead the train, not to sit on the train crying.
You got it.
I think that's so beautiful.
And Dr. Jean, how that happened, I consider myself fortunate that I found a very accessible keyhole issue with which to explore systemic oppression. Occupational burnout, believe it or not.
Yeah, I saw I saw your book on burnout.
Okay, so check it out.
And
I burned out.
I spent 2 years, as an academic, I'd go from theory to theory. So I spent 2 years on burnout.
There you go. So you're familiar with the work of Dr. Christina Maslach, Dr. Herbert
Yes.
Freudenberger, all of them, right?
Yes.
And I burned out at a time where the the nuanced and sophisticated way with which we speak about burnout in 2024 just wasn't true. Back then, if you type burnout into Google, you'd probably get the search result for a video game. That's how little we were talking about it in the zeitgeist. And here I was, somebody who lost their fire in service of, let me just say it, a bad boss. I'm not going to call this person a leader. I'm not going to dignify with them because they were truly an agent of the status quo. They were managing a situation. They were managing a person. And I burned out at this time. And it was strange because on paper, everything was going well. The portfolio of work was booming. We were winning awards, not just one award, like double-digit awards. The blueprint of our work was being replicated everywhere. My staff loved me. The impact of the work was visible. It was reverberating through the entire organization. I was then able to replicate that success in the private world, so on and so forth. Everything was going well, and then something changed for me. I actually suffered the panic attack that then created the cascade of illness, near injury, and according to two doctors, potentially I was going to suffer fatality. They said I suffered a silent heart attack based on the symptoms I
Wow.
described, which, it's shocking now, but it's very commonplace. People are
Yeah.
literally dying at work. I mean, the stats are staggering to me.
Yeah.
So this happened to me, and I asked the question. I said, why did I burn out in Canada's top workplace where I was encouraged to bring my whole self to work, where I had the golden benefits package? I mean, I was getting massages every other week. I could take mental health days. I was well paid. I mean that's debatable. Looking back now, it felt like I was well paid, but I was definitely underpaid and overwhelmed. Anyways, how did I burn out in this place? Because I was managing my time, my energy, my attention. I was fully optimized for productivity. Could it be that something was wrong with the environment that I was in? Was I sick or was the system sick?
There we
And
go.
that's when Dr. Christina Maslach's quote really resonated with me, which is, you can take, it doesn't, she said it so well. She said, workplaces can be very unhealthy environments. You can take a plant and put it in a pot and not give it enough water, not give it enough sun, give it lousy soil. It doesn't matter how gorgeous the plant was to begin with. It simply isn't going to thrive. And so then I asked the question, I said, what are the system level reasons why I burned out? Sure enough, a lack of fairness in the workplace, unsustainable workload, insufficient, uncommunicated values, insufficient reward, lack of control, poor/toxic community. And I was like, oh, okay, very interesting. Let's go further. What creates those conditions in the workplace? And you keep on peeling back that onion and you'll eventually arrive at the dark core of personality, which is human beings' hardwired capacity to accept, neglect, or provoke the disutility of others in order to maximize their own utility. In other words, it's the archetype we've seen since we were kids. It's what we read about in fantasy fairy tale books. It was the villain who looked after themselves, and it came at the expense of the people in their employ. It came at the expense of the people that they are entrusted to lead. And that is fundamentally what's at the heart of broken systems, of systemic oppression. It's people who are propping up the status quo. And the status quo, just so we're clear, isn't the avoidance of a decision. It's a continuous past decision. I'm so sorry about that. I ended by saying the status quo isn't the avoidance of a decision. It is a continuous past decision.
Yes. Yes. And through little bitty micro actions,
Yes.
day by day.
Yes. And I understand it. We human beings are hardwired to seek equilibrium. We actually don't want to change. We actually don't want to be uncomfortable. You just think about your own life. Think about the things that you do to make yourself comfortable. Whenever you feel like you are happy, you are actually in a moment of status quo. And if you were to perpetuate that moment ad infinitum, you would then affect the systems around you to keep you in that moment for as long as possible. Unfortunately, though, people find themselves in these situations. And as I said earlier, they're not malevolent, but they are accepting and neglecting the disutility of people who are not in that moment with them. And that is the problem with the status quo. That's why leadership needs to be reinvented. That's why we actually have to take a sledgehammer to these institutions that people are clearly losing trust in. Edelman has done this survey for the last 10 years. And I think this year they did it with I'm going to say 28,000, 32,000 people across 28 countries. And what they have found is that trust in four major institutions has been declining precipitously year over
Yes.
year.
Yeah.
Trust in NGOs, trust in media, trust in business, and trust in government.
Whose survey are you talking about here?
Edelman, Edelman.
Okay. I was thinking, and the Gallup poll has found the similar results.
Oh yeah, Gallup, their landmark survey. Every year they put out a survey of nearly 3 million people across 32 countries, state of the workplace. And it's so clear at this point, it just feels like, I feel like I'm talking into the ether, but I have to remind myself, Dr. Jean, is that most people are hearing this for the first time.
If we don't keep going, who are we counting on?
I know.
Right.
And this is why we have to be true to ourselves, like you urged me to do earlier. I feel like this conversation that we're having right now has put the battery in my back to just be unhinged and just say the thing, say the quiet part out loud, and do so in a way, though, that is masterful, recognizing that you and I have a unique privilege of being in spaces that most of our friends and family are not.
That's it. So I want to connect the dots between what
Please.
you said and what I described that happened to me in college and sometimes as a faculty member, where people would become white. Sometimes I look at people who are looking at me with hate, and I think they have not learned how to get rid of the stereotype. I have. They have not. And just as I asked my college friends to give me a moment so that I could move past the stereotype, so sometimes I realize I have to let this white person get past the stereotype so they can see me.
Yeah.
They're not going to see me automatically.
Right.
They weren't raised to do that.
Right.
Right.
That makes a lot of sense. And I've seen this even with my in-laws. My in-laws are all white. And for most of their lives, they have not had a person like me around them. There are some people who live so far north where the only other time they see someone like me is in the news, usually portrayed through the lens of, terror, let's be frank. They just see me as somebody that is remotely connected to ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and the enemy of the day. But then when I actually show up in person, I subvert all of the news and information and preconceived notions they've been forming in my absence, because suddenly I'm hanging out with them. Suddenly I'm joking. We share the same references. We're playing games together. We're laughing. We're singing. We're aligning on things that go beyond, food and occupation, recreation, and dreams. We're talking about values. We're talking about shared visions for a country. And suddenly the walls disappear. Suddenly they don't see me as a South Asian Muslim man. I no longer see them as a white, Catholic man. Just throwing some intersectionality out there. The outward identities dissolve, and we start to actually connect, frankly, at a spiritual level,
Right.
which is what I think is possible
Human
here.
Human
to human. And I think it's, and let me ask you this, Dr. Jean, your work, and I've read a couple of your papers. I've gone through your CV. I have listened to episodes of this podcast. I've read your blogs. I'm going to order some of your books soon. Forgive me that I haven't already done that yet, but are you familiar with the transcendental leadership model, the transcendent leadership model?
Yeah.
I'm not surprised because it was so clear to me. I wanted to ask you, that to me is where we ultimately need to go. We've moved from transactional. We're in the era of transformational, but where we ultimately need to go is transcendence. We actually have to break free from the status quo. We have to move out of ourselves, master leadership of self, others, organizations, and as a byproduct, systems. So I'd love to hear from you, your current thinking about that, and what are the steps that we need to take from the present moment to usher in an age of transcendent leadership?
Okay, so Maslow started off with those 5 boxes.
Yeah.
And he said, I'm missing something.
Yeah.
And he added 3 more layers at the
circle.
Transcendental level.
Yeah.
Okay, so he led the way with that.
Yes.
So the question is, how do we usher people into that? What I do is tell people to learn to respect their gut intuition, to believe in themselves, and how to distinguish between gut intuition and fear and animosity and all of the negative things. Because the transcendental impulse and the negative and the fear and anger and all of that stuff travel the same neural pathways.
Wow.
So it's what can feel. So if I'm afraid, for an example, how do I know if that's an impulse that's literally protecting me from harm? Or that's a stereotype I'm reacting to a stereotype that I was raised in. How am I supposed to know that difference? And the answer is, do you feel agitated or at peace?
Oh my God, I gotta write this down. By the way, I just have to say this because I know I'm gonna have some friends, family, and colleagues watch this recording. And let me just speak to you specifically, friends, family, and colleagues. You're seeing me react to Dr. Jean in ways that you have not seen me react to any other person on a podcast. And the reason why that's happening is because I feel like I'm truly meeting like an idol here. I'm meeting a celebrity. This is no different than if I were to meet, let's say, Cameron of the Diplomats, or if I were to meet Metallica, or if I were to meet like Tom Cruise out in the wild. I'm truly talking to somebody
Wow.
here who is at the edge. Like you are thinking about change and leadership in a way that like it's just so rare and so refreshing. You are in the top 0.1% of
And when you
thinkers.
first started doing all this praise thought, I thought, yeah, he's smooth. But then your face is sincere. So I couldn't
No,
discount you
100%.
but so long. And now I'm starting to believe that you really feel that. So I
Dr.
feel
Jean,
extremely honored.
yeah, I could share with you 400 pages of notes that I've been putting together for book number 3, which is about transcendent leadership, because this is where the road ends for me. When I started with that question of why did I burn out, it then led to what are the systems that accept, neglect, and provoke burnout? That question took me to a dead end, and that dead end actually ended up on the plains of the African savannah in the ancestral environment, because that's where the 3 brains developed.
Mhm.
So you talked about the first brain where we process and the neurological pathways receive information, but there's 2 other brains. There's our heart and there's our gut,
Right.
which are at least 100,000 years old, or 10,000 with no significant upgrades since then. So we're processing information in our bodies before we actually become conscious of them. And so many of the reasons why people are making bad decisions, specifically why leaders are making bad decisions in the modern era, is because their head, heart, and their hands are not aligned. That's simply it.
Exactly. Yes, that's exactly right. And they don't know what they don't know.
Bingo.
Yeah.
So sorry,
When
Dr.
we are
Jean.
agitated, when we are afraid, we have an internal shaky feeling.
Yeah.
When
Agitated and at peace.
intuition hits and we know what's right, we say, this is right. And I'm
Right.
prepared to face anybody who says it's not. And we almost have a feeling of peace.
Yep.
We just know it. I remember when I was applying to grad school, and I applied to 3 schools. And I said to myself, I'm going to Columbia. And Columbia was the top school. My grades from college were terrible because I was a half out of my mind at the time. I'm going to Columbia.
Yeah.
And I had no doubt. And I did. So
Wow.
sometimes things will hit me like that. I call it just downloads. I get downloads in the shower. You probably do too.
Yep.
And you just know
Mm-hmm.
there's no agitation. So if people learn to respect that feeling and then seek evidence to back it up, so you can't just have the feeling and think, oh, well, it's done. No, I had to apply. I had to do my due diligence. But I knew. And what I say, my motto is never argue with the universe. When the universe speaks to you, you just don't argue with it. And some of my clients, I will say that too, if I think they have that orientation. Just don't argue with the universe. It's telling you something.
Dr. Jean, I wish I met you 4 weeks ago because this is divine alignment, right? You've already introduced the idea that the universe is talking to us. So let me reciprocate and ride this wave with you here. I applied to grad school recently, so I had to drop out of my current grad school or my previous grad school because I was 2 years into my master's program, but they insisted on coming back to campus full time. They weren't
Oh, God.
accommodating me as a distant learner. I know. And so I was like, your loss, but it was a blessing in disguise because I actually wasn't feeling like I was thriving there. I didn't feel like I belonged. Their level of talking about systemic oppression bordered on anarchy. I mean, they were talking about like it felt hostile. It felt mean-spirited
Mhm.
because I was hearing things from my peers that were like straight up one person said, the reason why the world is the way it is because of credit to her, she rhymed. She's like male, pale, and stale. And I was like, I understand the sentiment, but that's just factually not true.
And
It might
it's
be, it might,
counterproductive.
it's counterproductive. So I was finding myself in a very radical, hostile space where I like to think of myself as a very open-minded person. I'm willing to learn, unlearn, and relearn. I just felt like it wasn't the right fit for me. So this lack of accommodation on their part was a blessing in disguise because I found a program that spoke to me, and it was at Teachers College, Columbia University.
Okay,
It
so I
was
want to
their
ask you something.
executive program.
It
Sorry, go
was a
ahead.
program. Where was it?
Columbia University Teachers College, the
Oh, is that where
XMA.
you are? Oh, hot dog. Okay, so I want to
Well, I
ask you.
just applied and I'm waiting for them to get back to me. I have an interview coming up with their executive director.
Well, see, teachers got it together.
They
Teachers,
do.
teachers know that they have a lot of different people in their classroom, and they have a lot of different parents that come talk to them, and they got to know how to handle them all.
Right. And I'm so glad that this program on change leadership is not nestled within a business faculty because I'm not trying to improve value for shareholders. That's not the world I'm trying to build. I'm actually trying to solve this problem at the grassroots level. I'm trying to change the conditions that babies enter into. I'm trying to change the world so that a child can be a child for as long as possible, can explore and grow and not experience those loss of innocence moments like you and I experienced, where
Right.
you were walking through your neighborhood at the time with the tall trees as you described, and then suddenly people became white to you. That's what we need to change. I mean, what would Dr. Jean be? Who could Hamza be if we didn't experience those blockers? If we didn't
That's
have
right.
people and systems make us feel like we don't belong?
Yeah.
Where could we have taken this?
Right. So I'm going to ask you something.
Please.
I'm going to ask you two questions, and it's the variation of the same question. Question one, at this former school where you said, I don't belong, when you finally accepted that, did you have a feeling of agitation or of peace?
Peace.
There we go. And when you saw Columbia Teachers College and the program, did you have a feeling of agitation or peace?
Peace like you wouldn't believe, Dr. Jean. So much peace that I didn't apply anywhere else.
Okay, so as an academic, I'm going to encourage you to apply other places and let the universe make it happen for you.
I know.
Okay, I don't argue with the universe, but I don't try to control the universe either.
Fair.
So just find 3 other places and then let the universe make it happen for you.
I'm on it. Hopefully this episode will release after I get my acceptance to.
Okay, you understand what I'm saying here.
I do. You're right.
Okay. Okay, so that's it. Now imagine CEOs, the C-suite, who understand this. Somebody would say there's something wrong with making everybody come back. We are excluding several demographics that will have a hard time if they have to come back full time. We automatically are cutting off certain demographics. Do we want to do that? Somebody is thinking that, but they're not saying it, or if they're saying it, they could be saying it ineffectively. They could be calling them a bunch of racists and ignoramuses, so they could be ineffective.
Right.
Right?
Right.
So what you're saying, your book, which I now want to move to, your book let me pull it up. Your book is trying to teach people how to do this by
Yes.
giving them of role models of how to effect change, so that you're not calling them a bunch of names.
Right.
What you were saying, the radical progressives that you were with before, they're not using a failing tactic.
Right. Absolutely. And this is what I'm calling for. I'm calling for a reinvention of leadership, because we received a system shock during the early days of the pandemic, which is when I wrote this book. There, I experienced a very visceral amygdala hijack, the part of our brains that is a remnant from our ancestral evolution. The amygdala went online, and it just took over my prefrontal cortex, the part of our brains that we require for high cognitive capacity tasks, creative thinking, future planning, communication, so on and so forth. And it turned that part of my brain offline. It flushed blood to my extremities, preparing me for a fight, flight, freeze, or fawn response. And in that moment, I felt an autopilot kick in. I felt like all of the actions, the learning, the preparation that I had done brought me to that present moment, and I was acting from my subconscious. And that was important for me, because once I experienced that and I was able to feel that fully, I started to see this play out during the early days of the pandemic. I started to see other leaders falter. I started to see other leaders fall back when I expected them to step up. And I realized that leaders actually stepping up during a time of a crisis is an optical illusion, because people are actually helpless during a time of a environmental shift. When there's an outside context problem that's sudden and unexpected, the more difficult it is, the more likely it is to present itself as a crisis. And in those moments, you don't actually step up, you sink back to your level of training, values, and overall
That's
preparation. Right. So what needs to change, and what I talk about in Leadership Reinvented, is there's 4 values in particular, which I believe leaders must invest in during peace times, during not necessarily peace times, but more stable times. And those are the values of servitude, which is really another way to say servant leadership, innovation, diversity with equity, inclusion, and belonging presupposed, and empathy. And the final form of all of these values, to know that you've succeeded as a leader, is when you've optimized and maximized servitude, then it results in belonging in the workplace. When you've operationalized and maximized innovation, it results in sustainability in the organization.
Whoa.
When you've operationalized and maximized when you've operationalized and maximized servitude, it results in thriving. When you've operationalized and maximized diversity, it results in belonging. And when you've operationalized and maximized empathy, it results in a compassionate culture. And that's ultimately what we want. We want workplaces where people are thriving. We want workplaces that are holistically sustainable. We want workplaces in which everyone feels like they belong. And we want workplaces where the default response is compassion, not malevolence.
Okay, so I want to ask you the question I get asked a lot.
Sure.
How am I supposed to be compassionate with a jerk who is a person of color, should never been hired in the first place? The supervisor, they let go some people, and this person got transferred to me. Now I'm stuck with them. They refuse to learn. What am I supposed to do?
I like this question a lot. The most human-centric thing you can do for a jerk is be consistent with the understanding that there's no such thing as bad employees, there's only bad leaders. And what a bad leader would do is accept and neglect this person who is in clear need of holistic development. They actually need to develop themselves personally, professionally, and maybe even academically. So the most human-centric thing you can do for them, the most compassionate thing you can do for them, is to swiftly exit them from the organization. It might seem like firing somebody is a bad idea. It's actually going to cause them duress, but it's a short-term step back for a long-term leap forward. They actually need to be moved on from the organization as efficiently and as compassionately as possible. It doesn't have to be, I'm going to fire you. You can do so in a very human-centric way. You can explain in great detail why they're being let go. You can make yourself personally accessible to them during the transition. You can create and co-create with them something to showcase to their future employers so that they can land on their feet sooner. You can gift them their technology. You can write them a heartfelt note thanking them for their service. There is a way to do this. And it's going to involve taking the higher ground. And I want to actually come back to what you've said. There's an agitated way to do this, and there's a peaceful way to do this. The agitated way to do this is to say, HR, get in here, get them out. The peaceful way to do it is exactly what I described right now.
Okay, so you've answered my question. So you've described, so I want one sentence about servitude, a complete sentence, a sentence about innovation, just more of a definition.
Sure.
So for you said servitude is servant leadership, which most people understand.
Servitude is about putting the needs of your people before your own needs.
Okay.
It's about wanting for other people what they want for themselves.
Okay.
And it's about centering the employee experience.
Context for them to thrive in. And
truly, it's truly about inverting the traditional leadership pyramid where we believe as leaders, we exist at the top of a structure and everybody serves us. Servant leadership is the opposite of that. We serve the people. It's about truly being a public servant. It's about truly being a servant in a prophetic tradition of being a resource to everyone and helping them thrive. A true servant leader makes themselves obsolete because they empower everybody else around them.
Okay. Innovation. Does innovation have to be a great big thing like invention of a computer or invention of an AI to be Canada innovation, or can there be small things that can be considered innovations?
I'm so glad you asked that. I get this question a lot because some people feel like servitude, diversity, and empathy are tightly grouped, but innovation seems shoehorned in. But servitude, diversity, and empathy do not work in an organizational context in a highly VUCA, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous environment. What innovation does is it allows us to harness a thriving workforce. Innovation allows for the maximum generation of new ideas, new creative thoughts, and new imaginations. That's what innovation is. Innovation is not about the technology. It's not about the devices. It's not about the new shiny balls. It's about new pathways that can only be generated when everybody, the collective intelligence of a thriving workforce is activated.
Okay, empathy. Are you talking about emotional empathy or cognitive empathy? I can understand what you're saying, but I have a friend who can understand somebody's position, but she can't feel it. I have another friend who feels everything.
I'm talking about a blend of both, Dr. Jean. I'm talking about the ability to stand in another person's shoes, to see with their eyes and to feel with their heart. That's what I mean by empathy. It's holistically embodying the other person's experience.
Okay, so I'm about to throw you a softball.
Let's go.
By diversity, do you just mean people of color?
No, I'm talking about the full diversity wheel, Dr. Jean. I'm talking about diversity of age, diversity of education, diversity of marital status, diversity of political ideology, the infinitesimal ways that we can slice up the human experience, the beautiful spectrum that is the human experience. I'm talking about diversity as holistically as possible. Okay. But diversity without inclusion is also meaningless because diversity is being asked to the dance or invited to the dance. Inclusion is being asked to dance. And equity is creating the optimal conditions in the dance floor environment and beyond to allow people to dance as fully and freely as they would like. And when that happens, the natural byproduct is belonging.
Yes. If I can dance the way I want to dance and not get laughed at, I belong.
I have nothing to add. That's perfect.
Okay. So what do you want people to take away from this conversation?
Ooh, my goodness. I want them to really meditate on this idea of agitation and peace, that dichotomy, and how it connects to belonging. If you want to know if you feel like you're belonging, do a quick gut check and ask, do I feel agitated in this moment, in this space with this person? If you do, there's something about the interaction, the person, the environment that you're in that doesn't allow you to feel like you belong. To borrow Dr. Jean's, what you just said earlier, you don't feel like you can dance freely without being laughed at. Or do you feel at peace? And actually, for the leaders tuning into this and the culture shapers, turn that question over to the people that you serve and ask them how they feel in an organization. Are they agitated? Are they at peace?
Wow.
And listen to your gut,
so cool.
Listen to your heart, listen to your head.
That's so cool. Okay. Hamza, I loved this conversation.
Me too.
It connects so much with our own work and conscious change. It 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 just met, and as a matter of fact, all four of your words, we don't use the term servitude, but innovation, diversity, equity, belonging, inclusion, all of that is part of our work.
Wow.
The four words you chose. So thank you so much for your time. And
Dr. Jean.
you will, and I've tremendously enjoyed it, as you can probably tell.
Yes, 100%. The feeling is very mutual, and I'm certain our paths will cross again. The wheels are turning, Dr. Jean. I would love to bend your ear in a couple of weeks about an opportunity to scale the work that you and I are doing globally, perhaps even across the universe.
I'd love to talk about it. Sure.
We will.
Okay.
Thank you so much. My best to your husband as well.
Hamza and I had a great time talking. His model for reinventing leadership and our own model for conscious change have much in common. He sent us his thinking about leadership on these four pillars: servitude, innovation, diversity, and empathy. I loved how he described the results of each of these components. Servitude is servant leadership. It means being a resource to everyone and helping them thrive. When you have innovation, the organization and the people in it are more likely to be sustainable. The end result of diversity and inclusion are a feeling of belonging. And empathy can produce a compassionate culture, which is ultimately what we all hope for. I encourage you to check out his book, Leadership Reinvented. And of course, I also encourage you to check out my new book, Conscious Change, which will be out on July 9th. You can pre-order it now at your favorite website. If you want your local bookstore to carry it, please let them know. And also send us the name of the bookstore and how to reach them, and we will approach them also. Thanks for listening.